Good evening and welcome to a special edition News Extra. I'm your host, Kent Jerson. Now this evening we're going to be delving into planning and development, a subject much in the news in recent years. The current Town and Country Planning Act was enacted in 1965. Now that's more than 5 decades ago, and government has determined the legislation is outdated and needs updating. Planning development is regarded as such an important issue in Barbados that it was identified as one of the items on government's mission-critical agenda. So here we are, less than 9 months after the government won the election, and there's a draft planning and development bill. That's the subject of our discussion this evening, and here to talk to us about it is the Minister in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Investment, Ms. Marsha Cadell. Minister, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening.
Now, as I said, the current legislation is more than 5 decades old, so we understand the need for it to be modernized and updated. Talk us through the process of getting to that stage where you are going about modernizing and updating the legislation.
Certainly. Well, the discussion really started in the context of growth and investment. The current legislation, it was determined, and it has been discussed for some time, was not as transparent and efficient enough to be able to facilitate investment and the sustainable economic recovery that we want to see in the country. So it was identified as one of the key things that we needed to address. Now, more recently, the Doing Business Index and the Doing Business Report were just released. Barbados is now at 129. Now, of those indicators that look at how easy it is to do business in the country, the ease and efficiency with which people are able to get construction permits in Barbados is one of the worst in the region. Now, we knew that that would be coming because of the trajectory of the last few years. And so we determined that we really needed to address this legislation, which really came about at a time when Barbados looked a lot different. If we are going to use the country's assets and manage them sustainably in a way that contributes to growth, we really needed to address the legislation and make sure that it was fit for purpose, transparent and predictable for people. So we started with 2 consultations in July, quite wide-ranging consultations. We heard from people in the sector, developers, people who work in the area of planning, and discussed with them what is deficient about the current legislation and what needed to be changed and updated, broadened, how the various roles needed to be, examined a bit more carefully. And from there, we came up with the help of some consultants, we came up with a green paper. Now that green paper was the subject of a lot of further discussion. It was available online. We got quite a bit of comments on it, and these comments range from the technical, from people in the area, to ordinary users who were able to say, these are the challenges we've had with taking applications before Town and Country Planning.
So the ordinary man in the street, so to speak, was able to have an input.
Exactly, exactly. And so we received those comments, and on the basis of those comments, we developed a white paper. Both the green paper and the white paper were laid in the lower house, and the green paper was debated. And on the basis of that, the draft Planning and Development Bill 2018 was developed.
You laid the foundation just now about why the need for the change of the current legislation, and you framed it in terms, to some extent, of investment in the country. But I want to go back to the actual consultation to talk about some of the concerns, issues that were raised regarding the current legislation, and so that we can get on to how the current bill addresses those concerns. So what was it that people thought needed to be changed? What were the issues that arose?
One of the clear areas of concern had to do with how long it took to get a response on an application. And as we get into what the new bill makes provisions for, we're going to look at some of the timelines that obtain. But one of the concerns that people had to do with, the fact that you send in an application and it's often some time before anything is heard. And we wanted to make sure that we would be able to stick to strict timelines, of course, a part of that is making sure that the Planning and Development Office has the wherewithal to do that, has the resources to be able to do that. And so that was one of the things that we looked at in the course of developing the legislation. For example, in the draft act, we made provisions for 28 days. 28 days is the time by which an agency that must consult on an application, that the time that they must reply to the town planning office. Now, I think one of the things that might be useful to explain and to discuss is the fact that when an application comes before the town planning office, often it is the subject of further, it has to be the subject of further consultation. I'll tell you what I mean. Every week now, we have what we call a minister's planning meeting, where we sit and look at certain applications and see, especially those that are very important, major investments that are coming up, and look at what might be some of the bottlenecks. Now, in those meetings are several agencies. You have Coastal Zone Management Unit, Environmental Protection Department, Ministry of Agriculture. There are a range of stakeholders that have to weigh in on consultations, on applications that come before the town planning office. Now, it takes time for them to do their assessments, but we felt that 28 days, and they felt that 28 days was a suitable time for them to respond. We had to go through and make sure that in terms of workflow and what is possible, that these timelines made sense. And so we came up with a series of timelines that apply to applications that require environmental impact assessment, what we call simple applications, those that are more complex, and we're able to attach timelines to those. So that was one of the main areas of concern.
So there are going to be differences in terms of how these applications are treated, because you would imagine some would be more complex than others.
Exactly. And so the one thing I should say here is that the bill has what you call schedules to the bill, and it also has regulations and a development order. These are things that provide further clarification and give more information about certain special circumstances. You appreciate that a bill of this nature is quite complicated, and there's so many areas that have to be covered. And so the schedules to the bill, the regulations, and the development order go into more detail about certain things that obtain. For example, what is a simple application and what is a complex application, and how are those determined? Now, all kinds of things have to come before the town planning office. That could be, you know, whether you want to extend your deck as a private citizen to whether you're building a large hotel. So some are more complex than others, and so there must be different timelines that obtain to those different types of applications.
Okay, you speak of deadlines, 28 days. Now, we know very often with the best intention, best will in the world, that the timelines are not met. What then?
Well, let me first say that we were very careful to try and come up with timelines that we thought made sense. And under the new bill, if a timeline is not met in terms of when an applicant should hear a response, and perhaps we can go into the timelines a bit, and I'll make reference to the white paper for that. So there are 12 weeks, the timeline is 12 weeks for response for applications where an EIA or environmental impact assessment is required. 10 weeks for complex cases or complex applications, and 6 weeks for all other cases. And what the bill says is that the time limit can be extended by agreement between the applicant and the chief town planner. And I'll tell you why we put that in place. Now, in many cases, an applicant will come back and say, listen, we don't have everything that is required in order to complete the application. We need a bit more time for X or Y, and that's fine. We don't want to hold the chief town planner or the Planning and Development Board to timelines when it's the applicant that requires more time. So based on an agreement between the applicant and the chief town planner, those timelines can be extended. If the time limits are not met, the applicant can appeal to the appeals tribunal, which is another provision under the bill. If the referral agencies fail to respond within the time allocated, the minister, the board, or the chief town planner is authorized to make a decision without their input. So there's a process for if the timelines are not met, and if an applicant believes that the timeline has not been met, then he can refer via appeal to the appeals tribunal.
Okay, I'm part of the overall thinking in terms of making this whole process a little bit more efficient and effective. Has been, I understand, a change in the governance structure. So if you could talk about that a bit. What is the major change there?
Well, the major change is that there's now in place, or there will be once the bill is passed, a planning and development board. Now, prior to that, the chief town planner had ultimate responsibility for every application. Now, what this bill seeks to do is to democratize the process a bit. And so the Planning and Development Board is made up of 12 board members. And they must, under the bill, meet certain criteria. They must be experts in various fields, including law, planning, and others that relate to these kinds of applications. And they have ultimate responsibility for each application. Now, as you will appreciate, there are lots of applications that come before the town planning office. And so what the bill makes provision for, and this was something that came to us in feedback during the consultations on the green paper, is that the Planning and Development Board can delegate simple applications to the chief town planner. And that is with a view to not having the same bottlenecks in the process that we're trying to avoid. But I want to say something important about the board, and that is that it is meant to increase the transparency and the level of accountability. The notion of having a single individual responsible for every application is one that could perhaps be a bit more democratic.
But doesn't that also add perhaps another layer on a system that was seen to have had too many layers already, and that contributed to the bureaucracy that obtained? I
don't think so. And certainly in the consultations, that was not the feeling by the public. What we got from the public is that they are uncomfortable with the idea of a single office holding ultimate responsibility for their applications. Having the Planning and Development Board, because the board's decisions must be made transparent, they're going to be published online and so on, it means that there's a greater sense of transparency and accountability. It's less discretionary. And people have more confidence that a range of perspectives are being brought to bear on their applications.
But there, from my understanding, some applications that the minister will be deciding on, and not the board.
Yes, so there are certain applications that, for example, relate to the subdivision of agricultural land, and that remains as it was under the old Act. And certain applications that also have to do with applications on the coast, so that have to do with coastal development and the use of those resources. Those go to the minister responsible for town planning. Of course, there are other matters that will go to the minister responsible on appeal. So someone might choose to say, I see that you have refused this application. I would like it to go on appeals basis, on a bit higher. And those are the kinds of applications that will go to the minister and or to the appeals tribunal.
Okay. The introduction of a board, though, doesn't that also add additional costs to the process?
Well, let's consider the cost of hundreds and a holdover from the last administration of unresolved applications. Now, what is it that happens when a potential investor, for example, does not get a response on a potential development that could create 100, 200, 500 jobs?
That person will leave.
Well, there's a high cost. So I would say that the nominal cost of having a planning and development board in place is much, much lower than the opportunity cost of hundreds of thousands, millions in investment that would stand to flee the country if we do not respond in a timely manner to applications.
And you keep getting back to the whole notion of investment as it relates to the bill. So let's go there. We've heard the talk, not necessarily seen the evidence, but there's always been the sense that investors who want to put their money into Barbados have been frustrated to some extent with the bureaucracy, with the delays. Is it your sense that through this bill, when it becomes the legislation, that we will significantly reduce that sort of feeling that's out there about doing business in Barbados?
Yes. So let me tell you about one, for me, the most fundamental change that this bill brings about. And it is the provision for what we call provisional refusal. Now, many of those who would have come through this application process before complained about the fact that often you're told no without much explanation. And so this legislation transforms the function of the Town Planning Office from that of being a mere regulator to being a facilitator of investment. So the provisional refusal says what? It says that we can tell you the Town Planning Office, the Planning and Development Board, may issue a no, may say, well, we can't accept or approve this application as it stands, but here are the things that would get you an approval related to this application.
So we'll offer some guidance.
Exactly. And some very specific guidance as well. So it puts the developer or the applicant in a better position to go back, make some changes to the application and come back and be assured then of an approval. This is very important. It is a proactive, pro-development approach to investment rather than just being a regulator who says yes or no. And we think that that is going to be a part of the restoration of confidence in investors that this bill will be able to bring about.
But I want to talk about the whole issue of transparency and accountability. We know that that was one of the guiding principles that you wanted to get to within the new bill. How does it make the department, not just the department, but all involved, the whole process, more transparent and accountable?
Well, one of the changes with this new bill is the stipulation that decisions will be published online. So first, and this is something that obtained under the old legislation, but there is provision for consultation. There's provision for if you are someone who you feel will be affected by a decision, there's provision for you to make representation to the board with respect to a particular application. And so to say, well, you know, I live in this community or I work in this sector and I think that this is going to affect me in the following way. And there's provision, first of all, for you to make representation to the board on a particular matter. Beyond that, though, once a refusal or approval is given, what will happen is that it will be published online. And so you will see at each stage of the process what has happened. Certain documentation related to the application will also be published online. And so people can get a sense of what has gone into making the decision, who has been a part of making that decision, so that there's a certain sense of predictability, a certain sense of confidence in who is giving the decisions. And
so
also
you're saying then that even the average person can review the decision,
yes,
see who was involved, and if necessary, and they feel that they've been affected in some way, they can actually go to the office or make an application to the office to have some change effected.
Exactly. So if it is a case where it has not, a decision has not yet been made, to make representation to be a part of the decision-making process and to say, well, listen, I have a perspective that should be heard by the board as it makes its decision on this application. Following the decision being made, if an interesting party wants to make an appeal on a certain basis, then there's also provision for that to be made. But I also want to come to what is a part of the efficiency, is not covered under the bill, But what we make provision for also is for applications to be submitted online, so that applicants can submit their plans online, but also that the agencies that have to consult on applications are also now able to submit their comments online, to review the applications online. And that also greatly speeds up what is happening and also makes it more transparent because people can see exactly what is being submitted.
One of the interesting, or one of the aspects that I found interesting in the bill as it relates to accountability is the whole notion of stiff penalties for all involved as it relates to, for example, bribes, not only for the public officers up to the minister,
Yes.
But also to the person offering the bribe.
Yes.
There are very stiff penalties there.
Yes. You know, this legislation is one example, I would say, of the government's move in the direction of transparency and accountability. One of the things that we have had to address over the last few months, is not just restoring the economy and, you know, making sure that those economic indicators that we've been working on are stabilized. But one of the things we've had to work on is restoring public confidence and also restoring investor confidence. Investor confidence is an economic variable. It is what is going to make the difference between growth and no growth. Certainly over the last decade, it was a lack of confidence that meant that the economy did not grow. So part of our task is to make sure that people see that we are moving in the direction of transparency and accountability. That's what the Public Financial Management Bill also did. The idea of making sure that the kinds of activities that were able to take place over the last decade are not able to take place without penalty again.
And just to be specific, it seems, if I read from the bill here, any person who offers or provides any financial or other reward to any person to whom the section applies for the purpose of inducing them to perform any duty imposed by them by this act, or to forbear for performing any such duty or exercising any power vested in them by this act, whereas the provision of this act or any written law may be evaded or violated, is guilty of an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $250,000 and imprisonment for a term of 2 years, or both. That's a pretty hefty fine.
You know, there's a cost of corruption, Kent. There is a cost. When people feel that there's not transparency, that they cannot have a sense of predictability on how decisions will be made, and that, you know, they are being made to pay more than what is the face cost of a certain good or service, it erodes confidence. You know, it means that those people may choose to opt out of the economic system, but it also means that when funds are diverted to all kinds of purposes, they're not being invested in the people of the country. You know, you find, and I recall making this point in the House before, you'll find that societies that have high levels of corruption also have low levels of investment in health, in education. These are real costs, and we can't take it lightly. We've taken it too lightly, I would say, for too long, and this government has made it clear that there's no place for corruption. Interesting
that you say we've taken it too lightly for too long. People will suggest that, you know, there are across various pieces of legislation, you know, this sort of penalty on the statute books. Yet, you know, nothing seems to happen. There seems to be no will to hold people accountable to that extent, to find them, bring them before the law courts, to deal with them in that matter. You might hear, for example, of something happening and someone being transferred, perhaps not even fired, but transferred. So I guess what I'm asking here is, are you assuring the public tonight that the intent here will be carried out?
I can assure of the intent, but I will go further. There are many arms of the judicial system, and they all have to play their part in collaboration with the public of the country. Yeah? So it means that, I mean, a minister of government cannot bring charges against any individual. The different arms of the judicial system, and we know what they are, who and what they are, need to pursue any evidence that is brought before it, or to pursue any indication that there has been a miscarriage of justice, and need to play their roles. If the executive of government were the judge, jury, and executioner, it wouldn't be a democratic system. And I say that to say that the various arms of the justice system have to observe the legislation, and where there is any breach of that legislation that looks to be taking place, have to pursue. Our job is to bring the legislation and to ensure within our power that it is enforced, but we need for all actors to do so, and we need for the public as well to be a part of that new direction.
In reviewing what needed to be done with the existing piece of legislation, for example, at the consultation, was that one of the areas that was identified as one that needed strengthening?
What's that?
Regarding the penalties and fines and enforcement for example, persons offering or accepting bribes as it relates to planning permission.
Oh, yes. You know, the feedback that we have gotten has not just been within the confines of the geographical space of Barbados. We have had several people who have attempted to make investments in this country, who have changed their minds, and that's why I talk about the cost of corruption, who have changed their minds because they were not willing to be a part of the system as it stood. And I'll leave you to your own interpretation of what that means.
I would ask you to be a bit more,
well,
to clarify that a bit more.
There are people that are not going to be willing to subject themselves to what they see as unnecessary or undue inducements to proceed. And those people certainly made representation to us in the drafting of this legislation, that they felt that if Barbados wanted to really improve its investment climate and the levels of transparency and accountability, that we would look at addressing penalties. But it was not just that. I think that overall, as I've said, we know as a government that part of our task is restoring public confidence. You know, we have to show the people of Barbados that they can trust their government. And that is what this legislation seeks to help do.
Okay, because it's good to hear you say that, because like I said, you hear the rumors, and you hear one or two stories, but if, as a government minister, you say you too have heard the stories of investors being turned off by the system, as it were, and it not functioning as it should, then I suppose there is a lot more there than just rumor and speculation.
But let me say this about rumor and speculation. It doesn't serve. So that one of the reasons we took the step of making information available online is that we want to remove the speculation. Speculation actually hurts investment and a growth climate and growth in a country. We don't want people to speculate, we want people to know. Predictability is what causes countries to grow. So we want people to be able to say, I know the basis on which this development was approved. I know what came up in the town hall meetings, and I know what the response of the developer was. I know what were the planning obligations that were put on the development, which is something that I would like us to get to as we go on in our discussion, the use of planning obligations. But we want to remove the sense of discretion and improve the predictability. Planning obligations, there's always been scope for it under the old Act, but I think that perhaps we haven't made it central to the legislation and we haven't made enough use of it. So planning obligations really, or what some people call planning gains, is conditions that you apply to a particular development. So for example, you may stipulate that development must create, along with whatever is the hotel or the factory or whatever you're constructing, that it must be accompanied by preservation of green spaces or building of green spaces, or it must use a certain percentage of local artisans or local labor. These are the kinds of things that allow us to manage development in a sustainable way and also allow the economic enfranchisement of people in the area or in the country. Because in some jurisdictions, what you'll see happen is that development will take place and leave behind many of the people in the surrounding areas. We want to ensure that as we try and manage development and growth sustainably in Barbados, especially now that we are in a recovery program, that we make full use of planning obligations. We feel that if a developer or an individual or an entity is benefiting from the patrimony of a country, is benefiting from our very valuable natural assets like the coastline, the beach, the agricultural land or arable land, that there also has to be a level of further and future investment that that individual makes, and that we use planning obligations in a proactive way in that way.
How exactly will that work? Is it that it's going to be a mandatory something for the developer, or is it going to be discretionary?
Well, there's a reason it's called obligations. As I said, we're moving towards this being a conversation. And what you'll find is that often developers already come in with an idea of how they want to invest in the area surrounding or in the population surrounding an area. We've found that certainly in with the investors that we've been talking to. And so they will say, well, you know, we want to develop this area, but we want to make sure that there's a bike path for people who want to bike, or that there's a play park. You know, one of the things that is on the lips and in the minds of Barbadians a lot is law and order in the country. Now, these things do not operate in a vacuum. And you may find that some of the response that you're getting among young people especially, is based in part on really a lack of occupation, both formal employment, so jobs, but also ability to recreate. You know, when is the last time you heard of a new community group or a dance group, or you know, what is the level of investment in local sporting clubs, or what has it been over the last decade? So more and more, community development is going to play a role and should play a role in social cohesion. And so we want to make it clear that we're not just building houses or building hotels, we are developing communities, and planning obligations contribute to that.
There's a school of thought that suggests that, as you say, many of the investors coming in already with an idea of where they would want to contribute as good corporate citizens, but they should be in effect mandated to get involved in major projects that the government or Barbados as a community has determined that it wants to pursue. So it's not necessarily what the developer wants to put forward, but what Barbados believes it needs as a country. Are you thinking of going perhaps that far, taking that additional step where investors are concerned?
Well, yes. I mean, that's what we mean by the use of I mean, we're calling them planning obligations, because we use that term. But the point I was trying to make earlier is that often it is not a case where you are carrying the developer kicking and screaming down a path. Many of the people, you know, Barbados has many friends, and that's perhaps been our biggest strength as we've tried to claw our way out of the last decade. It is that people are interested in the well-being of the country. And so it's not a case necessarily where you have to enforce and mandate. It is really a conversation where you present what are some of the wins on either side that development of a certain nature will lead to. So I'll give you an example. If you are developing a housing development, for example, and you want people to buy or rent a unit, you want to make sure that people have amenities. You want to make sure that people have green spaces for their children to run around in. You want to make sure that that they feel a part of that area as a community. That's going to get those units sold. And so it's not just about mandating the developer to do something. It's about making sure that the investment is worthwhile for everyone involved.
Okay, let's go to another topic within that can be contentious at times, and that is government's land acquisition, of course for social good. How is this legislation, or the bill as it is now, how does it address that particular process in a way that avoids some of the pitfalls and some of the issues we've seen in the past, delays in payment, that sort of thing?
Delays in payment to
the person from whom the land is being acquired.
Well, the planning legislation does not speak necessarily specifically to government acquisitions. I think that, and again, you'll find that there are schedules and development order to the bill. I think that in general, we are trying to ensure that all of government processes support efficiency, so that where there's a case that in order for development to happen, there has to be some acquisition by government, or there has to be some purchase by a third party of government land, that we make sure that it's done in a timely way. Okay.
Now, of course, in terms of planning development, one of the issues that has arisen over the years is that of squatting, several areas. How does this legislation, this bill, how does it seek to address that in terms of avoiding that particular situation? And in terms of the current situation, is there any mechanism therein to help resolve the particular issue?
The issue of what I prefer to call informal settlements in the country is one that has its roots in several things. One of those you will find has to do with the timely and efficient transfer of property, transfer of title to individuals, which is something that over the last decade has also lagged considerably. And so that's something that we've made a commitment as a government to address. So there have been several people who have been waiting for the transfer of title, and because that has not happened, they are technically not the rightful owners to the property that they occupy. So that's one side of it that has to be addressed. Another side of it, well, perhaps the core of the issue has to do with how we develop and make available housing to the population. Because I know that when you raise the question, you're looking at simply at it as a regulation issue. But again, we can't simply regulate our way out of every problem. And so we have to find pro-development solutions. Government is perhaps no longer in a position where it can be seen as having to provide housing for all. What government needs to do is to be able to facilitate the sustainable provision of housing. And that's something that we're working on as a matter of urgency. We have not just the problem of informal settlements, but we have the issue, for example, with some of the old housing units that were built perhaps for a 4-person or 5-person family. And because of some of the social and economic conditions that have obtained over the last few years, you'll find that these units now house 14 and 15 people. And so in certain units, in certain areas, we have this problem of overcrowding that leads to all kinds of other social problems.
And there's also the issue of extensions to some of these buildings, which I suppose is something that could be addressed under this particular bill, because I see there is a provision to retain a structure that was not given planning permission initially.
Exactly. So to regularize some of the initiative that people have taken, because again, we don't want to simply be a regulator. We want to be able to facilitate the ways that people live. And to the extent that we can help people regularize things that they've already done or changes they've already made, the bill makes provision for that.
Does it make that process, though, easier, simpler?
Well, I would say so. I would think that people who have, first of all, there's a reason that people may not in the past have sought to regularize those things. And it is that before, it would simply have been a no. And that's, you see, enforcement can also be used in a pro-development way. We have to have enforcement. When the town planning office or the planning and development office serves an enforcement notice, that too can be a conversation. So that instead of just saying, well, you know, this structure has to be removed, there are ways to facilitate those individuals to be able to come to something that is perhaps more palatable under the law, and that's what the bill makes provision for.
As you said earlier, the department now will be offering guidance.
Yes.
So maybe that is one way in which it can help to facilitate a
Exactly.
transition from those structures to being technically illegal to a more acceptable situation.
Yes, and let me say this is not simply a matter of wanting to enforce. You know, we are talking here about safety and security of the population. Often people may make adjustments that they themselves do not understand, compromise their own safety and the safety of those around them. And the bill has to be able to account for that. Certainly we want to make sure the way people build their roofs is in a way that is climate resilient, and that, you know, if there's an extreme weather event, that they don't lose their investment. And these are the things that we make provision for as well under the bill. It is not just about telling people no because we say so. It's about ensuring that people and those around them are safe.
And you talked about the board a little bit earlier and it being a diverse group of individuals. What are some of the professions that are represented or are going to be represented on the board?
The board is going to consist of the chief town planner and 12 people. So it's going to have 4 what we call ex officio members from relevant government departments. And that would include the head of Coastal Zone Management Unit and others, for example, EPD and so on. In addition, there will be a member that's recommended by the National Trust, 2 members that represent professional land use planners, architects, engineers, land surveyors, and 4 members that are drawn from the legal profession, from financial institutions, from private sector, academia, or NGOs.
Yeah, interesting. Now, I want to go on to our cultural and natural heritage.
Yes.
As it relates to planning development. There's a feeling that we have not done all that we can to capitalize on our cultural and natural heritage. How does this bill plan to do a better job or assist us in doing a better job in that respect?
Well, one of the things it looks at is in the definition of development, what is considered development. So, for example, under the bill, the demolition of certain natural, cultural, or heritage assets would be subject to the bill because it would constitute development. So it would then no longer just be, you know, okay or outside of the bill for people to go ahead and remove or alter something that is considered a heritage asset or that might be considered a heritage asset. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to make sure that the National Trust was represented in the applications, because we want to make sure that we are maintaining the cultural heritage of the country. One of the other things I should mention in that regard is the use of the role of the physical development plan. The physical development plan, the one that is currently in use, I believe dates back to 2007, and there's one under development now. And what that does is it looks more holistically at how we see development across the country, so that we're not just looking at individual applications for buildings. We're looking at what do we want the landscape of the country to look like. I think that in some cases, some of the planning obligations might relate, for example, to the facade of buildings, so that we want Barbados to look like it's in the third decade of the 21st century, but we also want it to look like Barbados. The bill now requires that if you want to demolish a building that may be considered a heritage asset, that permission must be sought, or if you want to make significant alterations to that building. But the other point I was going on to make is that the physical development plan, to which this legislation is subject, also seeks to have a more holistic approach to how we plan land use in the country. The balance of residential and commercial, the balance of agricultural and residential, that the bill cannot exist, or really does not have the strength of force that it would need unless it is also accompanied by that physical development plan, which also accounts for the cultural and heritage assets of the country and how we keep that balance of old Barbados that tourists do also want to see and that we want to enjoy, and new Barbados.
One of the issues that has been identified in the past with retaining especially our built heritage is the lack of enforcement or teeth within the legislation. There are stories, of course, of, for example, if a particular area was designated as such and you wanted to remove the trees, then you would be subject to a fine. But the fine itself was so minuscule that people would just go ahead with the development and pay the fine. Are those sorts of issues addressed within the bill?
They are. Bearing in mind that this legislation, that there are also accompanying pieces of legislation that are being reviewed, because again, there are certain aspects. You mentioned the removal of trees. Before, that was all contemplated under the old Act, but now this Act moves that responsibility, I believe, to the Ministry of Agriculture. So it means that the agencies need to talk to each other, but also, as you say, that certain types of trees of a certain age, of a certain size, we used to have lots of mahogany trees around the country. We see that we no longer. That is also subject to regulation, and it will also be subject to fines. I'm hoping, though, that in the process of this conversation that we're having with the country, that we don't necessarily end up on the punitive side of things, but that people agree with us, and certainly this legislation is based on consultation with them, that there are certain things that we agree in terms of our collective values that we want to see remain in Barbados.
And of course, I agree with you there, but it's always good to ensure that the legislation has the teeth to back up what it is that you want to see happen. In terms of the areas, for example, the Bridgetown, Greater Bridgetown area, there are quite a few areas within there, that for a long time people have thought could be better developed.
Yes.
How would this sort of legislation facilitate that process as we move forward?
One of the things that we are developing, and perhaps this is not strictly speaking to the legislation, but it is related. We will have in March a tourism investment conference. And this relates as well to the physical development plan. One of the reasons we thought it important to have that is that there are entire areas in the country, especially in the urban corridor, and I'm talking about that area from Oistins all the way up maybe to Fitz Village, where there are potential areas for development and redevelopment, certainly that some people have shown an interest in, and that we believe Barbadians, and that includes Bridgetown, we believe Barbadians have an interest in seeing developed in a way that we all can agree to, or in a way that we are all on board with. And so one of the reasons for that tourism investment conference is that we want to say, listen, these are the areas that are available, and the Prime Minister has referred to it as a bespoke tourism investment conference, because we want to package these areas and say, listen, these are the areas that are available for development. And as a part of that, what we want to be able to do is to facilitate quick investment of these particular areas. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is going to become a hotel. What it means is that as part of the physical development plan, we agree on the areas where we might develop, we talk about smart bridge town, so where we might develop or encourage technology investors to come in and operate in a certain area, or where we might develop the renewable energy sector. So across a range of sectors, we want to be able to say, well, these are the areas that are available for development, and we want to help you facilitate that. Bridgetown and Greater Bridgetown, we believe, is going to be an important part of that. You know, we see that there are quite a few derelict buildings that people are interested in building out and developing. We want to make sure that that is done in a way that is holistic as a part of the physical development plan, and that we don't necessarily just have individual developments that don't feel a part of a whole. And so that is what the conference in March contributes to.
How did you determine what areas that you want to have investors invest in? How was that process?
Well, there are some clear areas that where there's no activity, and that, for example, are primed for activity, especially in what we call the tourist belt. So, for example, the area along Lower Bay Street, you know, where that area where government headquarters now sits, perhaps might not be the best place for for a government headquarters building. Are
you suggesting that it will be moved in the near future?
It might be, but what we're saying is that there's a vision, and it's not just our vision, but there are others who have come in and have given their ideas on what a vibrant Greater Bridgetown area would look like. For example, we want to see young people living and working in Bridgetown again. Now, Bridgetown as it stands is not conducive to that. But I know certainly 10 or 15 years ago, when I was younger, I may have wanted to be in a vibrant, emerging tech space where everything was happening and where you felt as if lots of ideas were converging in a particular sector. That is what Bridgetown is primed to become. That is what people are interested in helping it be. And so, you know, because they're areas where there's a real dearth of economic activity, we think that those are some of the areas that can be developed.
Okay, what next now for the bill?
The bill is currently before the lower house. It will be, well, first on Tuesday, we bring back some of the stakeholders who've been a part of the consultation to do a review of the bill. So we come together, we talk about what it looks like, what it provides for, where some of the small gaps might be that might be subject to amendment. But the bill is before the House now, and we think it has really stood up to a lot of rigor and to a lot of consultation and to a lot of review. We have a stakeholders review on Tuesday, then it is debated in the House on Friday and hopefully passed at that time before it goes to the Senate.
Well, thank you very much, Minister Cadell, who is the Minister in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Investment.
Thank you, too.
We've been talking planning and development this evening, of course, with Minister Cadell. That's it for our program this evening. I've been your host, Kent Jerson. Do enjoy the rest of your evening.